Our first speaker is Katlyn McClellan from South Dakota State University. She is a PhD student at South Dakota State whose research focuses on sow nutrition and strategies to improve sow longevity. She has conducted extensive work on sow iron deficiency anemia during both her master's and PhD studies. Katlyn's talk is sponsored by the National Pork Board, and she'll be talking about optimizing gestation nutrition to mitigate sow anemia, improve farrowing outcomes, and support longevity in the prolific sow.
All right, can you hear me? Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be up here to share some of our sow work with you today. Thank you to Dr. Knauer for the 4 to 5 mentions inserted into your talk. Sow anemia has really been a key theme of my graduate work over the past few years, and so I'll spend some time talking about its prevalence and what some implications are associated with it in the sow. And then I'll also go through some strategies to mitigate the prevalence of it in the sow and some things we need to work on moving forward. So we often hear terms such as sow robustness and sow resilience, and I don't think we have a perfect way to measure sow robustness, but this figure, you can't really see the sow very well, has a good idea of what we mean by sow robustness. For us, a robust sow is one that can stay productive across multiple cycles, and so this is why in sow research we find it extremely important to look beyond the current cycle, because that sow might look great today, but the real question is, can she keep a good level of productivity over time? Additionally, high total and live-born is great, but is she also weaning full value viable pigs, and is she doing this without exhausting herself? So her ability to stay healthy and remain in the herd is critical. So why is robustness being challenged today? We all recognize the tremendous genetic progress that's been made over the years. Sows are now producing 16 to 18 pigs per litter and upwards. And with this increase in litter size, we've also seen greater fetal growth, bigger placental mass, higher milk yields, and an increase in blood volume, all of which push her nutritional and metabolic demands much higher. So the challenge isn't necessarily genetic progress itself. The challenge is, how do we support the sow to meet these new demands? So a key challenge we face today is that nutrition really hasn't kept pace with genetic progress. We're still working with feeding models that were developed from the outdated sow model, and the NRC estimated requirements do not match the needs of today's prolific females. However, it is true that the industry has adopted higher nutrient fortification, but in some cases, especially when we're talking about trace minerals and vitamins, these decisions are mostly driven by practical considerations and not necessarily scientific evidence. And so the sufficiency of what we're providing the sow is really unknown. Additionally, while we know the sow nutrient needs shift dramatically in gestation, we still do not implement phase feeding. That is not commonly done in the sow herd. So what's the impact of insufficient nutritional support to the sow? Of course, nutrient deficiencies, especially in late gestation when those demands ramp high. That really sets the stage for more farrowing complications, reduced sow longevity, and lower lifetime productivity. And we're also seeing more peripartum mortality and higher removals concentrated, especially in those first and second parities, which is the exact point we should be protecting the sow's long-term potential. Now to shift gears into a specific research area we've been focusing on, that's probably become clear at this point. This directly ties into those nutritional deficits we see in sows, and that is sow anemia. This figure here comes from my very first master's project that I conducted a few years ago. In this study, we simply measured hemoglobin in a small group of gilts across their reproductive cycle and followed those same females across 3 consecutive parities. As we know, hemoglobin is a marker of iron status in the body, and what we found here was that hemoglobin does decline across each reproductive cycle, and more importantly, the ability to recover from that decline diminishes after each cycle. Now, a follow-up study was then conducted in 101 late gestating females with the objective of determining how hemoglobin levels would impact the farrowing process. We found a negative association between pre-farrowing hemoglobin and farrowing duration. We then classified the females as anemic or non-anemic using a 10 grams per deciliter threshold, so the females falling under that threshold were deemed anemic, and those falling at or above 10 were deemed non-anemic. And you can see our anemic females had over a twofold increase in farrowing duration. Now, while we've consistently used a 10 grams per deciliter threshold of hemoglobin to classify sows as anemic or non-anemic, there really isn't a lot of data to confirm that 10 is the optimal threshold we should be targeting. So to dig deeper into this, we broke these females into more specific hemoglobin ranges to see how farrowing duration was impacted, and we observed almost a linear increase in farrowing duration as anemia status worsened. And in terms of farrowing duration, there is earlier work that would suggest that we want to target under 300 minutes in order to mitigate high stillbirth incidence. And in our data here, the only group that remained under that 300-minute mark were those that fell in the optimal category, which were females with hemoglobin levels above 11 grams per deciliter. Now, some more recent work, and this is actually something we're still actively working on, is screening sows in commercial herds to evaluate the associations with production and sow retention. The data I'll share with you today comes from 4 relatively high-performing U.S. herds, where we enrolled a total of 1,945 late gestating females. Each sow enrolled into this study was tested for hemoglobin between day 85 and day 110, and then evaluated for body condition at that same time. We then had production records extracted from these farms for each sow enrolled, along with any removal or death occurrence, and we tracked those occurrences for 70 days post-enrollment. Now, when we classified all females enrolled into this study using the 10 grams per deciliter threshold to define them as anemic or non-anemic, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a relatively conservative cutoff at this point, we did see quite a bit of variation in anemia prevalence across farms. So even within the same production system, you can see that anemia prevalence ranged from about 46% to as high as around 61% in the same production system. As you can see, all females in this study put into this graph, you can see the average hemoglobin across parity, and more or less hemoglobin declined as parity increased, which would complement my earlier work done in my master's. The only group that fell just above the anemia threshold were the gilts. Now, this figure goes along with that last one and shows anemia prevalence by parity among those around 2,000 sows. And as you can see, anemia generally increased with parity. Gilts had the lowest prevalence, but even there, our gilt anemia prevalence was just at over 40%. Now, you can imagine that comparing outcomes is quite challenging when anemia is so closely linked to parity. Here you can see that average parity was higher in the anemic group. However, I will note that we did include parity as a fixed effect to help account for this. You can see on here the body conditions were lower in our anemic group, and interestingly, we have consistently found a positive association between hemoglobin and body condition across our work done in this area. Now, looking at reproductive performance by category, our anemic sows actually had higher total and live-born numbers, so by some measures, they were more prolific than our non-anemic females. However, where these females were challenged was they had higher stillbirth rates, they weaned numerically less pigs, although no difference between the groups. So that increase in total and live did not necessarily translate into more pigs weaned. But most importantly here, our anemic females showed a dramatic increase in removals from the herd within those 70 days post-sampling. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I included it because it's very interesting to look at. When we break the females down using those same 4 hemoglobin ranges we used in the previous studies, we see that total and live-born numbers increase in the anemic categories as they worsen, but so does stillbirth rate. And there's no difference in pigs weaned overall, though there's a numerical decline in the severely anemic group. And once again, most importantly, removal rates in the sows were higher in both anemic categories compared to the groups with hemoglobin above 10 grams per deciliter. Now, based on a survival analysis of this data set, we found that both hemoglobin and caliper score were associated with removal risk over that 70-day period. Specifically, each 1 gram decrease in hemoglobin increased removal risk within those 70 days by 43%, and each 1 point decrease in caliper score increased the risk by 8%. Now you might be thinking, isn't the higher removal rate in anemic sows only because they are of higher parity? And the answer is no, because the effect is fairly consistent within parity. As you saw in previous slides, even our gilts had a prevalence of anemia of over 40%. And when we look at removals within parity, our anemic females had higher removal rates all the way from gilts through parity 3. And for our older sows, 4 and up, we actually did not see a difference in overall removals between the groups. So some key takeaways before I move on to nutrition on anemia in the sow herd. We know anemia is highly prevalent in sows. And while our anemic sows appear to be the more prolific females, they're also the less robust females in the herd. They're not likely to have a long career in the herd, and the implications from being anemic include various things that we have found, such as higher stillbirth rates, prolonged farrowing duration, an increase in premature removals, those removals especially concentrated in earlier parities. So why are sows anemic? We're still investigating this, but it's likely driven by underlying nutritional deficiencies. So this opens up some opportunities for us to evaluate strategies to both prevent and mitigate anemia. Now, being that we are likely not feeding the sow to her full potential, we have recently conducted a study where we have increased all nutrients known to influence hemoglobin and iron metabolism, at least the primary ones. Specifically, we have conducted a late gestating phase feeding study where we enrolled 70 gestating females on day 70 of gestation. Allocation of these females was based on parity, body weight, initial blood hemoglobin, and prior reproductive performance. Sows were either fed a standard gestation diet from day 70 to day 110, or they were fed a phase-fed diet with enhanced nutrients during that late gestational period. So a critical aspect of this study is that these sows were followed into the next reproductive cycle and re-enrolled onto their same treatment diet if they had remained in the herd. So to give you a visual of what this feeding program looked like, you can see that again the control sows were kept on that static gestation diet, and then they were switched to a common lactation diet prior to farrowing. Whereas the phase sows were switched off the standard diet at day 70 and enrolled onto that advanced diet, which they received until moving to farrowing, at which they were then also switched to a common lactation diet. Now, to quickly highlight the main diet changes, our phase diet had higher crude protein. It was a difference of around 16.5% compared to 11%, and this was achieved by increasing soybean meal inclusion. Our SID lysine levels were targeted to match fetal demands based on earlier work, providing nearly 19 grams of SID lysine per day in the phase diet versus around 11.5 grams per day in the control. Our vitamin and trace mineral premixes were included at 2 times the rate of the control, with the exception of selenium. And our calcium and phos were formulated to meet the late gestation NRC estimated requirements. And you can see our metabolizable energy was similar between diets, as was feed intake during gestation. So this feeding method is not at all the same as what we know as bump feeding. Now here's a quick look at our vitamin and mineral premixes. I've got columns here as well so you can see the comparison to standard industry levels as well as the NRC. Our control diet was quite similar to standard industry levels, whereas our late gestation diet was 2 times the rate. And I think it's really important to note here that industry standard levels are already much higher than the NRC requirement estimates. However, again, specifically for vitamins and minerals, this is mainly based on practical decisions rather than strong scientific evidence, and so we're currently providing what might not be enough. And so before I move on, a quick note here, all of our trace minerals were organic. So what outcomes did we observe when we provided the sow more nutrients in late gestation? First and foremost, our farrowing duration was decreased in our late gestation phase sows by approximately 70 minutes. As expected, implementing this diet in late gestation did not impact total born. Numbers were nearly identical across treatments due to our allocation method to try and achieve a similar total born across. However, we observed a numerical increase in live born, likely driven by the trend towards lower stillbirth rates, which were about half that of the control. Average pig birth weights were similar, though you can see that there's a trend towards slightly lighter wean weights in the phase sows, which is likely driven by the fact that those phase sows weaned 1 more plus piglets on average than the controls. However, no difference in total litter wean weight. We had greater survivability in the phase-fed progeny pre-weaning, with a lower pre-weaning mortality and a higher overall rate of pigs weaned in the phase-fed progeny. We did not observe any major differences in sow body weight change across the experiment. However, you can see during lactation there was a numerical difference. Our phase sows actually showed a slight weight gain compared to our controls who lost a bit of weight. Back fat was greater in our phase sows by day 110, with a larger overall increase across the gestational period. You can see that the phase sows did lose more back fat in lactation, but their overall back fat status across the entire experiment remained improved compared to the control group. So I will note we did not observe a statistical difference in lactation feed intake, as you can see. Now, sows fed the late gestation phase-fed diet, most importantly, showed a tendency for improved blood hemoglobin just after 40 days of being on that diet. And the levels were also higher at weaning. So improved hemoglobin here, and then additionally, we also looked at ferritin, which is a iron storage marker in the body. We saw an improvement or a tendency for improvement in ferritin at weaning. So overall, improved iron status in the sow. Our vitamin D levels were also higher in the sows at both pre-farrow and post. However, this difference no longer persisted at weaning, which was expected since all sows did switch to that common lactation diet. Now, piglets born to phase-fed sows showed numerically higher hemoglobin at birth, and ferritin levels tended to be higher at birth in these pigs as well, suggesting, again, improved iron stores in early life. So then by weaning from the phase-fed sow, or from the phase-fed progeny, we also tended to see the higher serum vitamin D concentration. So overall, this provides indication that maternal nutrition during gestation, specifically in this case late gestation, may have carried over to benefit the progeny micronutrient status as well. So I recognize this is a smaller data set, but I want to highlight the removals here. I think it explains or helps explain the fewer animals carried over into the next cycle and provide some context for interpreting our cycle 2 data. So as shown here, we had 14 total removals from the control group compared to 7 from the late phase group, and 4 of the removals on each side were due to age. So for all the following data, this accounts for 21 total females that remained for 2 cycles in the control and 28 total females that remained in the phase-fed group. So our phase sows had shorter farrowing durations again in cycle 2, so both cycle 1 and 2 compared to the control group, lower farrowing durations, and no change in duration across cycles within either treatment. Our bicycle analysis also showed that our phase-fed sows had more total born and live born pigs in cycle 2 compared to the control group. You can see they increased in prolificacy dramatically, and importantly, that improvement across cycles was significant within the phase-fed sows. Now, with our phase-fed sows averaging over 19 total pigs born in cycle 2, we actually didn't see that birth weight was affected. We observed no difference in average pig birth weight between the groups in cycle 2. And among the data set of the sows that remained in the study, the phase-fed progeny weaning weights were lower in cycle 1, which we saw, but we actually saw a great improvement in the phase-fed sows' average pig wean weights, so they significantly improved by cycle, and there was no difference between the two treatments. And this graph here can likely explain why we maybe had heavier weaning weights, which I don't have the graph here, but we did have heavier total weaning weights in our phase-fed sows in that second cycle. Numerically, they wean more pigs. We didn't reach a statistical difference, but you can see the difference there is quite meaningful. So some key takeaways from phase feeding sows. One cycle of phase feeding resulted in shorter farrowing durations, a decrease in stillbirth rates, improved sow and pig micronutrient status, higher piglet survival to weaning, and less sow removal occurrence. After 2 cycles, we still saw that reduction in farrowing duration, despite that increase in 2.4 total pigs born and the 2.7 more live-born pigs. As far as our future steps, again, like Dr. Knauer said, we need to work on refining these nutrient levels, which will likely take quite a bit of time. Now, I'm just going to quickly highlight some iron-specific strategies that we are actively working on as well, in which the goal is to specifically target the iron deficiency piece of this. So the first and I think most obvious strategy when we think about anemia is giving the sow an iron injection. And the rationale for injecting sows with iron is pretty simple to understand, I think. Iron injections may bypass the limitations of intestinal absorption of iron, potentially allowing us to rapidly replenish those iron stores in the sow. So for our current ongoing study, we're evaluating the use of intramuscular iron dextran in early gestation, comparing a 2,500 and 5,000 milligram dose of iron dextran early in gestation in a high-performing commercial herd. So we're assessing the impacts of this strategy on sow anemia prevalence, the relationship of inflammation and iron status, as well as sow retention. And then finally, to start working on refining some nutrients, we're working on defining dietary iron requirements in the sow. I think prior work has really focused primarily on the pig's iron status as well as pig outcomes, and there's really limited work evaluating the sow herself. So to address this, we're conducting a small-scale controlled trial in gestating and lactating sows using a dose titration of dietary iron ranging from 0 to 400 ppm. And assessing a comprehensive panel of hematology as well as iron markers in the body. I will note the challenge with this, when we're trying to determine the requirement for a specific nutrient such as iron, this actually becomes really complicated to accurately establish a requirement for something if it's so impacted by other nutritional deficiencies in the body. So some final thoughts here. Anemia has a significant impact on sow robustness and longevity. Low hemoglobin in the sow is associated with prolonged farrowing durations, increased stillbirths, early removals, and higher mortality. Providing sows with enhanced nutrition in late gestation did show promising results. We saw that improvement in micronutrient status in the sow and pig. We saw the improvement in farrowing duration as well as stillbirths. Overall, I think we have the ability to support greater sow robustness and longevity, but moving forward, I think really important to assess sow nutrient requirements for multiple nutrients, protein, trace minerals, and vitamins in order to implement better feeding strategies that address sow nutrient deficiencies. So ultimately, prioritizing the sow. So that concludes the information I have for you today, so I'll just take a second to thank some folks. First off, Dr. Eric Weaver is actually my PhD advisor. I think him and I have very similar perspectives as it relates to the sow, very much on the same page as what's important and what we need to work on, so I very much appreciate his support. Also would like to sincerely appreciate all the individuals and groups on the screen for either supporting our work or supporting my PhD program in some way. Thank you.
All right, I think we do have time for a few questions. Get this out.
Yeah, are you asking in regards to defining the iron requirement? Yeah, so when it comes to that, we are planning to supplement in late gestation. That's typically when blood volume increases dramatically. So that's when we see she's most efficient. So yeah, late gestation, and through lactation as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was a really interesting presentation. I may have missed this, but I just wanted to ask the question: Is the sow or gilt anemic all the time, or just going into gestation and after? Like, is it generally speaking, do we think throughout their lifetime they are always anemic and we're just not hitting the mark, or what's kind of the overall status, or is it a specific time when she's anemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did touch on it very briefly, some of my master's work, but it wasn't exactly clear. We spent time tracking hemoglobin across gilts, across 3 parities, which gave us some indication of the patterns of change over time. A couple other researchers have also done that work as well. What we see is that as gilts, they're really at the highest they'll ever be, and from there they just decline. I will say they decline across the reproductive cycle. Once they wean the pigs, after they end that cycle, there is natural recovery, so they do recover in some sense, but they never recover to the point where they originally were in that previous cycle. So after each cycle, they're just diminishing, and then they never catch up. So at some point, they become chronically anemic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Time for one more question.
All right, thank you so much, Katlyn. That was a great presentation, and appreciate you sharing.